The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Polly Young Eisendrath. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is a psychologist and Jungian analyst in the Philadelphia area, and a research psychologist at the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. Welcome, Polly. We're glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Eileen.
Your latest book, You're Not What I Expected, Learning to Love the Opposite Sex, concerns the use of dialogue therapy as a means to move couples from disillusionment, that inevitable disillusionment that happens in marriage, it seems, to trust and on to mature dependence. And as I was thinking about that simple statement, I thought that gives us enough to talk about for the next half hour. Do you think?
Oh, I agree. I agree. I think even the idea of disillusionment is not one that's clear for a lot of couples. When people fall in love, they believe that somehow the romance should lead directly into an intimate relationship. And actually, for everybody, romance leads to disillusionment, not directly into intimacy. And it's only when the couple actually agrees to make it work that they can move from disillusionment into an intimate partnership and the kinds of satisfactions that most people are now looking for in a marriage.
Why is that, Polly? I mean, why don't we just fall in love and it lasts forever and it's wonderful?
Well, I think that was probably from the beginning a fairy tale and based on a kind of wish fulfillment for people. But in a very specific way, it's because falling in love is a kind of craziness. It is an event in which you imagine that the other person is your soulmate or your dream lover, your ideal in some way, and you fall in love with that image. And that person is not going to be the image that you believe that he or she is. So that when you get together and become committed in some ways, and for some couples this means just to be called a couple, then you start to look at each other more seriously. And what happens then is that this original illusion falls away, and you move into a kind of disillusionment where you feel unhappy or disappointed or annoyed or sometimes even duped by the other person, feeling like, well, this wasn't what I expected, this isn't, what I wanted. And at that period, couples typically get into a power struggle, and they often see each other in very negative ways that again are fantasies. Often fantasies of parents, like he sees her as his mother, picky and critical and demanding, or she sees him as her father, distant and aloof and unable to talk about his feelings. And here they thought in the beginning they were getting away from these negative aspects of their parents. Suddenly it seems that they're confronting these things. And actually many couples remain in this state of disillusionment. And in our society, I think it was expected for a long period of time that marriage would be just like this, that marriage would be a kind of Cold War, or at least a battle between the sexes, or some kind of drudgery. It wasn't expected to be very much fun. And so I think, we're in this period of time right now where couples for the first time ever really are asking for intimacy in marriage, and they want it to last for the entire marriage. But they don't know how to make the step from this disillusionment to intimacy. And too often they think that falling in love is the solution to the whole thing. So often what a young couple might do is get together in the romance and then live together or go out together. The disillusionment sets in. They start feeling like this relationship is more trouble than what it's worth. They give up the relationship and go on to another romance thinking, well, next time I'll find the right person, and never really knowing that they're going to have to go through the disillusionment again. Older couples many times just live in the disillusionment and kind of give up trying to make the relationship be what they would want it to be ideally. And so the whole thing about romance is that It's based on illusion from the beginning. That's why we have this sort of, rosy-colored view of the world when we're in it. And of course, romance feels very good when it's going on, but it doesn't lead directly to intimacy, and it's not the same thing as intimacy either. Intimacy is based on a real knowledge of the other person and an acceptance of that person as a really close friend.
And a knowledge of who that person really is, not that fantasy dream lover that you've talked about that we project onto the other person, who may, and I thought this was an interesting point, who may be simply unlived portions of one's own life.
Exactly, right. At the falling in love time, often what's projected is an ideal or a wish that one has for oneself, like maybe I see in myself the ability to be a writer or to be a musician or to have some children and a nurturant future. And so I find a partner who seems to represent that, and I choose him thinking, well, if I choose him, I'll bring that to me. He looks like a good family man, or he looks like he's very creative. So, there's this effort to bring to oneself an excluded part of the self.
Well, and certainly it's
romance.
Easier to marry a writer than to be one.
Than to become one, right?
And you
exactly.
know that.
Yes, exactly. And so, it's easier to think you're going to bring it into yourself from the partner. But then on the negative side, too, people insist that partners carry negative parts of themselves because, in a sense, we don't really want to completely get rid of these parts of ourselves. We like to keep them close by, and so we'll insist that members of our family carry negative things that we don't see that we're doing, but we actually see happening in the other person. So we tend to attack our partners in the disillusionment for negative things that come from the self as well. And the discovery of that is often very painful, to recognize that you might think your partner is aggressive, but perhaps you're the aggressive one. Maybe you're the one who starts the arguments or starts the fights, or maybe you think your partner is really passive, but perhaps you've been sitting around and not carrying out the things that you wanted to do in your life. So on both the positive and the negative side, we ask our partners to carry these parts of ourselves. And when we take them back, we can then develop that sense of authentic relationship, of seeing the other person for who he or she is, but then seeing the self also for who we are. Yeah.
And that's valuable too, because sometimes we have positive things, positive unlived things in the self
Yes.
that we'd really be well advised to own and take back and develop.
Absolutely. I think many times women in particular have idealized men and assumed that men would bring them financial security, creativity, cultural life, and so on, things that women themselves need to develop and now have the possibility of developing these in their own lives for themselves, freeing up their relationship to be a really close relationship and not a sort of arena in which the woman's trying to develop the partner.
Well, I remember typically in the late 60s, early 70s, young women would have worked in order that their husband could get a degree.
Mm-hmm.
And when he got that master's degree or PhD, he promptly left them for a woman who was more educated, who was more closely allied to what he was looking for. And the woman was left feeling she did all this for nothing.
Right, and maybe she gave up her creativity in the meantime. She was working as a secretary, or she was working as a nurse or whatever, and she wanted to develop some part of herself, but she kept working so the husband could develop into someone who was creative and successful, and once he reached that point, considered her to be no longer a suitable companion.
I want to spend some time on the whole sort of kernel of this idea of disillusionment. Seems to be related to projection, which is always a difficult concept for me to wrap my mind around. Give us some examples that you run across in your work with couples of what happens when I project my stuff onto my partner.
Well, in the simplest possible way, the way that projection feels to the person who's doing it, it feels like you know what's going on inside the other person. When you say to yourself, I already know, I know what's on his mind, I'm sure he's feeling this way, I just see where he's headed, that's coming out of your own fantasy. And so at that moment, you're projecting into the partner some part of yourself. And people are very good at doing this in a way that almost evokes from the other person part of what this fantasy is. For example, if I'm thinking, about my spouse say, gosh, he's a pretty aggressive guy, and I'm watching him as he's making deals or talking to people on the phone, and I'm thinking, this guy is a kind of a nasty guy. He's pretty aggressive. And so in various ways I accuse him of being aggressive. I might say things like, I think your tone is wrong. You're too loud, or I don't like the way you say that in that tone, and I don't like the way you walk through the room. There's a certain kind of intrusiveness about the way you walk. And so what's going to happen? He's going to say back to me something like, hey, cut it out. Don't treat me that way. So he's going to be aggressive. Then I'm going to say, see, that's exactly what I was talking about. So there's this peculiar dance that people do in which they exclude parts of themselves, find them in other people, and then encourage another person, particularly an intimate, another person who's close by, to play out that part. And then they say, yeah, that belongs to you, where actually it's coming out of oneself. So projection always feels to the projector like you already know what's going on in this person. And that's kind of a signal to take a deep breath and ask a question. Say, hey, what's going on with you? Or how are you feeling? Instead of assuming, I know what's going on with you.
Now, it seems to me very difficult to pull back those projections, because then you're beginning to investigate what's going on inside you. And that's a very subjective, iffy kind of, sometimes painful kind of thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, sometimes people discover in their very most negative projections that some really difficult things have happened to them as children, and then they need to go into therapy to work on that. I know for myself that I had a very frightened feeling when I was first married about my husband's more sort of depressed moods. I would feel very frightened, and I would have what I would call my dark hole experience, where I would feel like I was going into myself and kind of losing touch with things. I would do everything I could to cheer him up and get him out of it. And what I realized eventually, I was reacting to him as I had reacted to my father, who, when he would go into a depression, would become agitated and frightening. So I would try to keep my father out of these depressive moods. And if he went into one, he would do things that were aggressive and frighten me, yell at me, and make demands and so on. So here I was repeating this, but in order for me to realize that I had to do something about it, I had to see that it really wasn't my husband who was the issue. He was neither depressed nor was he aggressive. It was my reaction to little cues in him. And then once I realized that this was my stuff, in my case, I really did need to go and talk about it with a therapist. Some people can simply recognize something in themselves, a pattern, a reaction from childhood, and it's not a particularly difficult one. They can begin to say, hey, yeah, maybe this did happen with my father or my mother, and maybe my father or mother wasn't perfect or wasn't ideal or even nurturant.
So this is a sorting process, if you will. This is my stuff, this is your stuff.
Yes.
Let me ask you, and you can maybe tell me whether this is my stuff or your stuff.
Yes, and in that way, in 1925, Carl Jung wrote an essay called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship. Now that was quite a long time ago. But what he envisioned was really pretty much the process that you just described. Two people in a contained relationship where they have a kind of security of their bond together, being able to help each other see the truth of the self. This is my stuff, this is your stuff. He didn't mean that they would become therapists to each other and sort of heal each other or care for the wounded child, as some people say right now, but he meant more that they would act as kind of mirrors and be able to reflect back to each other who they were, who they are. And I don't think it was possible to do it back in 1925 because men and women did not have equal possibility of an equal relationship in marriage.
I think that's a very important thing, the idea that we can't know ourself alone.
Yes.
We only know ourself in that relationship, or the mirroring, as you have termed it, which is good. So a good marriage, a very good marriage, can be that kind of thing, but I also think it's important that you said it shouldn't be a therapeutic relationship, because that places a whole other kind of burden on the marriage that perhaps it wasn't meant to be. Yes,
I actually think that if one partner attempts to act as a therapist to the other partner, that spoils the intimacy of the relationship, because again, it turns it away from the equal dynamic to a dominance submission, one person being superior, saying essentially, hey, I understand your psychology, but you don't understand it. And that will completely disrupt the sense of partnership and intimacy. So people need to stay away from that. And too often couples get into that, especially if one of them is reading psychology or one is in therapy. And often it's the woman who is the one who's in therapy or reading the books, and she comes home and she says to him, I know what your problems are now, and I know why, because your mother did this or that, or your father was like this or that. That doesn't go. That creates the wrong dynamic for the partnership. But being able to say to the other person something like, help me understand what's going on with you, you begin to sort out who you are and who they are. So that in that moment when I would go into my dark hole, if instead I said to my husband, I'm having kind of a reaction to you at the moment, what's going on right now? Maybe he would say to me, well, I'm getting a cold or something, And so it would be completely different from what I had thought. And it's in being able to ask questions and listen carefully that this process of growth takes place, but it's not in therapizing each other.
The next step, it seemed to me, in looking at your book, out of disillusionment was moving to trust. That also seemed a difficult process to me, especially in some of the cases that you've mentioned in the book, the 4 composite couples that are in your book. Some of them had very distrustful experiences.
Yes.
How does one move when disillusionment contains lack of trust? How does one move to trust?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, it's not an easy process. If you remember in the book, there was a couple in which the woman had had an affair, and she was actually coming into therapy now with her husband, saying that she thought she wanted to separate from him because he wasn't as sexually exciting as the man that she'd had the affair with. Now, that's a profound break in trust in a couple relationship. In order to repair that, it takes a lot. And in fact, when a couple has had a very bad break in trust, I recommend that they go to therapy. But the process is that first, the partner who has caused the greater hurt, the one that has, in this case, the woman, needs to be able to really understand the other person's experience, how, in this case, he suffered from what she did, what his feelings are, how he is seeing this in terms of their relationship. She needs to develop empathy for him. And this is difficult for her at this moment when they're coming into therapy, because she's still angry with him. She's angry with him because he doesn't want to have sex with her very often, and she sees him as rejecting her. He's actually kind of anxious about himself. But so she's angry with him, but she's going to have to empathize with him and recognize that she has hurt him deeply. At the point that she really understands it, she can ask for forgiveness. But I find that in order for people to forgive a very difficult break, like a betrayal or some difficult lie or whatever, they have to believe that the other partner really understands the hurt that has been caused. And when they hear the partner tell the story from their side and really feel it, many times then they can forgive. And then the couple needs to go about building this basis for dialogue, which is learning how to listen and ask questions, and also to use anger rather than aggression when they have a conflict. That's another big one for couples in ordinary disillusionment. Most of us, when we come through the disillusionment, we want to hurt our partners. We want to attack them, so that we either do an active aggression, which is to blame or criticize or psychoanalyze.
Insults.
Yes, insults. Those are active forms of aggression that will drive the other person away. Or we do passive aggression. Leave the room. Don't talk about it. Use humor instead of talking seriously about it. Or just procrastinate on things that you were asked to do. These are all passive forms of aggression. Aggression is a way of hurting somebody else. When you aggress against another person, they're going to fight you back, or they're going to flee from you. They're going to have a fight or flight reaction, because it is not a situation in which you want to come closer when someone is aggressing against you. So when couples go through disillusionment or when they've come through a very difficult break in trust, they tend to be aggressive, passively and actively aggressive, hurting each other more, driving each other away from each other. So they need to stop that process completely. We simply set as a rule, and in the book I say this, no aggression in an intimate relationship. You can use aggression at work, you can even use aggression with your children if you want to, because sometimes you need to take a dominant position there, but not with your partner, because you want to create an atmosphere of trust in which two people are relating as equals in a close friendship, and aggression doesn't belong in that dynamic. Instead, when you feel angry or you feel that something is, needs to be addressed, a conflict, use statements of anger, like I am angry about that, or I don't like that when you do so and so, or I won't tolerate your treating me this way or talking to me this way. Now, these are also strong statements, but they're not blaming. They're simply saying something about I. The Greeks called anger the moral emotion. And they saw that anger was a response to a feeling of injustice and realized that human beings use anger, but animals do not. Animals use aggression, though, but they don't have the capacity to be angry, only aggressive. So if you can think of using anger as a positive part of working through your disillusionments, your conflicts, and so on, it's something you can trust because it's not going to drive you away from each other. It causes frustration, it causes annoyance, but it doesn't break the bond and it doesn't accuse the other person. So you use the anger, you use the skills of the dialogue, which would be to ask questions, to listen carefully, and to paraphrase. And you can make your statement clearly about your own anger and help your partner understand what you're angry about. And then gradually through dialogue, couples are able to reach some kind of resolution about the things that are keeping them in conflict. Sometimes they simply resolve to have a difference, that they may never see this thing exactly in the same way. Sometimes they resolve to have one person carry out, maybe one person has a strength. Like in our case, I'm much more the housekeeper type. I was socialized that way, my husband wasn't. And when we sort of sat down to plan out what were we going to share in terms of housekeeping and childcare and so on, especially as our children got older, at first I was into sort of thinking that he was going to do part of the housework and I was going to. It turned out that it was just much better if I just did the things that I was good at doing and liked to do because I had standards for them, and he did the things that he was good at doing and liked to do, like he does the yard, and we do pretty much the traditional gender roles because that's how we were socialized, that's how we grew up. And I don't consider that to be a problem, although I'm a feminist and I'm very much for women speaking out for themselves. I think people, when they come up against these conflicts about how are they going to work out their differences, many times they need to specialize and do what their strengths lead them to. So there's a lot that goes into, where we started here was to say, what's the movement from disillusionment or a break in trust to trust and intimacy? And there's a lot that goes into it, but particularly stopping the aggression, learning to use dialogue, being able to continue to ask questions and listen rather than knowing in advance, and then gradually working out your differences and your areas of specialization based on your strengths and the things that you want to do, which leads to mature dependence.
When you and your husband work with couples, you teach them this dialogue therapy, and it occurred to me that the empathy and the listening skills and the paraphrasing skills, which I think are quite difficult to learn, entail a kind of discipline that perhaps is the same discipline that is necessary to build intimacy.
Yes, exactly. You're absolutely right. It is a discipline. I almost consider it a meditative discipline because you have to become alert to your own subjective experience, your own feelings, because you can't go with your feelings. You're going to have to listen and you're going to have to respond to somebody else. So there's a discipline in it, and that discipline itself does build for a trust, or it builds towards a trust in an intimate relationship. Couples learn how to do this in dialogue therapy not because they want to learn, not because they're interested in changing their skills or in becoming better communicators, but because when they come into therapy they're hurting an awful lot. And many of them are looking at the possibility of losing their relationship if they don't change. And generally, when people come for couples therapy, they do not want to change as individuals. Each person wants the other person to change.
Of course.
So generally people, one spouse brings the other spouse hoping she will change. So when they get into the therapy situation, then we set up this framework in which they're both going to change, but we don't ask either one of them to change. We're just setting up this kind of container for intimate partnership to take place, and we're going to teach them how to use these skills and how to make this kind of frame for themselves in which they can be more meditative and disciplined in the way they respond. And it usually takes the first 3 or 4 months for people to actually catch on and begin to use these things, because at first they want to go back to their old ways, and maybe they in some ways don't believe us that if they make these changes the relationship will be much, much better. But after 3 or 4 months, we find with all couples that stay and are committed to doing this kind of work, they begin to internalize the things that we're teaching, and lo and behold, their relationship starts to have a kind of vitality that it hadn't had previously. And they begin to wake up and say, gosh, this is incredible. I didn't know it could be so much fun. I've been with him for 35 years and I never thought he was fun at all.
And the amazing part, I think, is that your structure for this is just 6 months and 6 sessions with the couples. It's really a very short time, and perhaps one follow-up session at the end of that year. And it struck me as quite amazing that the couples could progress that fast and that solidly in that amount of time, although I assume they have some homework in
Yes,
between.
they do. They have homework in between.
Time. In the couple of minutes we have left, I just want to touch on something I thought was important, sort of the end process that you call mature dependence. And of course, dependence is often a negative term, especially when applied to women today. Is the pendulum swinging from the idea of autonomy and financial independence and emotional independence for women, or is some of that included in your idea of mature dependence?
It is included in it. First of all, I think that dependence has gotten a lot of bad press. And this comes more from the sort of models of psychological development that have been around for about the last 50 years, in which we've seen sort of autonomy as the goal. Actually, there's no such thing as an autonomous person. All of us need people. We all need other people in order to live. It's like from birth to death, we are dependent. We are social beings. We're not beings that are like rocks, that sort of exist on their own. We need each other.
Unfortunately, we need to finish. But it's been wonderful
It's been very good.
Polly.
Very good. Thank you very much.
You came to the Twin Cities, and thank you to our viewing audience for watching a discussion with Polly Young Eisendrath.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.